Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today for this Foothold webinar on reducing stress and building resilience. Now, some of you may already know that Foothold has a really long 130-year-old history actually of supporting engineers and their families, and over that time we have expanded our support in many ways. Some of that support you can see on this slide here. Now, because we want to support as many people as we possibly can, our focus now is to offer more digital support. So it's support that anyone can access from any corner of the world at any time. And in the handout section today, you will find the link to our new wellbeing hub. It's available to all engineers and their families completely free, so please take advantage of that. Now, a bit of housekeeping for today before I get started. So today's presentation will be around 30 minutes and there will be plenty of time for your questions and answers at the end. If you have questions at any point as we go along, please post them in the questions box, and we will try to cover as many as we can at the end. But if your question doesn't get answered, please don't worry. We will be sending around all the questions and answers to the attendees to the email address that you registered with. So you will get that information either way. Okay, for now I am really pleased to introduce to you Peter Scott, who is a chartered engineer and also a wellbeing specialist, a really unique combination, and I'm sure you'll agree, offering a really great insight into the demands that the profession places on people. So we've been working with Peter for a couple of years now, and his articles and videos on our website have helped a lot of people improve their well-being and just find out more about how their mind works. So I will stop talking and hand over to Peter. Hello, so nice to have you here.
Thanks, Aranta, and thanks for the kind introduction. It's always a pleasure to be able to address the wider engineering community, and I'm sure that we'll discover lots of new things today. Obviously, if you've joined us here, a warm welcome to the webinar. We are obviously discussing the subject of stress reduction, and in particular, we'll be focusing on coping mechanisms to deal with stress and how to build personal resilience. But of course, to be able to combat any kind of unhelpful level stress, we first need to understand the subject, and that takes us to our agenda for today. So I'll be starting off by introducing what stress is and isn't. We'll be talking about the difference between acute and chronic or toxic levels of stress. We'll be exploring some of the mechanisms behind stress and how stress affects you, and understanding the threat response or the stress response within your body. We'll be signposting some stress management strategies with the view of showing you where you can intervene, and we will also be focusing heavily, of course, on ways to cope with stress and to build your personal resilience. But before we start, or before we go too deep into things, I'd just like to begin by having a little poll here, just so I can get an idea of the audience. So what I'd like to ask you is, has your sense of well-being been negatively affected by stress in the past 6 months? Now I'm just going to launch that poll, and if you are kind enough or able to select one of the answers, yes, no, or maybe, that will just help give me an understanding of people who are attending today. Now we'll give you a minute or so to submit your answers. I'll perhaps just give that another few seconds, and then we'll close that poll, which should have given us adequate time to make a selection. And we'll close that in 3, 2, 1. So if we share those results, we can see that over the past 6 months, it feels like everybody's sense of well-being has been negatively affected by stress. And of course, that's no real surprise when we consider the global pandemic which is at play. But it also reflects some of the statistics that we're seeing from perhaps Mind and Health and Safety Executive and such like. But that's helpful, so thanks for doing that for me. Okay, so moving on, and let's start to introduce stress. Okay, so it's something we certainly all experience, and as you can see from the poll results, it's something that you've experienced. It's a normal experience of being in the world, of course, and of course it's across cultures and across all industries. Certainly something that varies in intensity and duration, and obviously the amount of stress that you feel varies depending on what you're doing. So perhaps if you're visiting the dentist, that can be a source of stress, or perhaps even giving a webinar like this may be a source of stress for many people. But it's not something that we're really looking to stop entirely. Okay, stress isn't necessarily a bad or unhelpful thing. But it is something that we want to regulate. We want it to be a healthy level of stress, which helps sometimes actually increase our sense of well-being, increase our abilities. We just want to ensure that we regulate it and stop it becoming chronic or toxic. Now, to be absolutely accurate about what stress is, it's really a biological reaction to a stressor or a trigger, something which is often in the environment. So when we talk about feeling stress, what we're really doing is we're feeling that biological response, that biological reaction to something in our environment, which is perhaps threatening or is perceived as being dangerous. So stressors obviously vary. We did mention about whether visiting the dentist or something, or perhaps it's something in the environment which is causing physical concern. But they certainly vary, and they can also be not just an external event in the world, but also an internal state that you experience. So they can certainly vary in what is apparent. And it's also important to understand that stress and anxiety are not quite the same thing. Stress is very much a result of a stressor or trigger in the external environment, but when we talk about anxiety, well, that's really our actual response to that stress. It's an element of self-generated stress rather than something from the environment. And of course, how we define our challenges dictates how we treat that. So that is important to understand. It really is. And of course, the impact of stress is quite significant. The World Health Organization a number of years ago considered stress to be the epidemic of the 21st century. Now, of course, that was before we had the experience of COVID-19, but it does give some gravity to the situation. And from looking at the most recent figures that were published by the Health and Safety Executive, we can see that almost 18 million working days are lost each and every year in the UK alone, and which are attributed to workplace stress and anxiety. And if we look at those figures even closer, it's actually quite fascinating to understand that the engineering community at large is one of those that are most affected by work-based stress and anxiety, and that's highly linked to perhaps the highly variable nature of what we're trying to influence and control. And that's particularly the case if you're an engineering professional or a female within that industry. So it's worth knowing these things. So let's start I'm just going to shift my screen a little bit there. So let's start by exploring stress, okay? How stressors, stress and anxiety affect you personally. Well, really, a stressor is something that affects either your feeling of safety, your feeling of connection, or your resourcing, some kind of threat in your environment, okay? And that's picked up by our brain, okay? We have our conscious awareness, so we may see, let's hypothetically say that we see something that's worrying in our eyesight or our eye line. We can respond to that and we can know that that's a threatening thing that we want to move away from. But we also have something called, what I like to call the smoke detector, which is really a part of the brain called the amygdala. Now that smoke detector is constantly scanning and sensing both your external and internal environment, and just searching for signs of smoke, which potentially mean that there is a threat in the environment. So between what I term the watchtower, the medial prefrontal cortex, which is your perception of what's going on, and this automatic smoke detector, which is continuously sensing, at some point, if a threat is found in the environment, then your stress reflex or stress response system is activated. Now, when that happens, what we do is move from what would probably be termed rest and digest or functional engagement towards what's known as the fight or flight response, which also includes freeze, fawn, and shutdown and such like. But a shift happens within the body, and it happens in two ways, which we'll go into speak about in a moment. And the point and the purpose and the function of this is to prepare your body to take action. And that can be a number of different actions. That can be to approach what is causing difficulty or threat in your environment. It can be to avoid it, or it can be to change the way that you're responding to that in a way to mitigate some of the concern. But ultimately, when that stress response kicked in, you will feel a difference within your body. You may start to notice that your heart's perhaps beating faster or harder than it did before. Maybe you're starting to perspire or sweat a little bit more than you did. Maybe even experiencing a dry mouth. Or perhaps it's even just your ability to think is becoming more clouded over time rather than the clarity that you're used to. And all these are sort of physiological responses to stressor in the environment. So in other words, it will affect how you feel first, and you will also start to begin to think and act differently. So when that stress response does kick in, we certainly don't want to stay there. It can be a very adaptive response. It can help you get yourself away from something which is threatening. But to stay in this state of being for a period of time is not good for our body. It's not good for our well-being, and it can certainly reduce our immune system. So it's not something we want to stay in. But the important takeaway here is that stress, or that stress response, will shift every single aspect of your experiencing, how you feel, how you think, and how you act. So as mentioned, the stress response is actually twofold, and I'll explain to you why that's important in a minute. But it's worthwhile noting that there's a two-stage response. The first we'll look at is what happens within the autonomic nervous system. Now, you may or may not have heard of that, but the autonomic nervous system is a small subset of your overall nervous system, and it very much regulates your internal balance. And it has a sort of accelerating and a brake function. Now, the accelerator, which is really known as your sympathetic nervous system, and the brake is known as the parasympathetic nervous system. Now, that's a slight oversimplification, but it's good enough for today's purposes. So when that stress response kicks in, the autonomic nervous system very much puts the accelerator to the floor, and it starts to release a number of changes within the body, which you feel, and adrenaline is released by the adrenal glands. And that process of between the accelerator and the brake is often mediated by something called the vagus nerve. Well, what is termed the vagus nerve? Now, the vagus nerve is really vagal nerves, because there's a pair of them, and they start in the brain and the brain stem, and they travel all the way down to the colon. And this vagal nerve is a very, very important function because it can become stuck. If you spend too much time in the stress response, it can struggle to put the brake on and help you return to that state of balance, which is needed for your health and well-being. And the reason I'm mentioning this to you is there's actually ways that we can manipulate that vagal nerve, or those pair of vagal nerves, to actually put the brake on ourselves. And that's perhaps something that you've heard of. Most often, people I find that attend these kind of webinars haven't heard of that. So that's going to become really important in a moment when we talk about coping mechanisms. The second part of that stress response is what's known as taken part by the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, nicknamed HPA axis. Now, you don't need to concern yourself with that too much, but in effect, your autonomic nervous system is doing one thing, and the HPA axis is really stimulating something called the pituitary gland within the brain. And that releases a stress hormone that it releases a hormone, should I say, that travels through the bloodstream all the way to your adrenal glands, where it eventually releases the stress hormone cortisol. So between the autonomic nervous system and the HPA axis, we're releasing adrenaline and cortisol to be able to adapt to something which is threatening in our environment. Now, the second part of that stress response can be regulated. It can be reduced by our approach and attitude in life and how we appraise any kind of threatening situation. So I'm just going to summarize that to say that there is a twofold response to a threatened environment, and we can manipulate both of these differently, one through the vagal manipulations and other through our appraisal approach and attitude. So before I go on much further, I'd just like to gauge whether anybody currently in the webcast today is utilizing a stress management strategy, or perhaps doing something that works for them in reducing the amount of stress. Now, I'm just going to put that poll up just now, and if you could take just a minute there to click yes or no, just so I can understand if you have things in place to deal with the stress that comes each and every day. Now we can see that everybody's now voted upon that poll, so I'm going to close that poll a little bit earlier than anticipated. And I'll share those results. So you can probably see that 60% of people, or the majority of people, don't have a stress management strategy in place or a method for dealing with stress, which is which is what I expect to see, to be honest. But I think what we'll do, to be honest, I'm quite glad to see that some people are, almost half people have some kind of form of mechanism to deal with stress, and that's a particularly good thing. But what we'll do now is we'll close that and hide that result, and we'll move on to the next screen where we can go into signposting stress management. So stress management. There's three main components to any kind of stress management strategy. There's stage one, which is to do with awareness. Stage two is intervention. And stage three is review. So when we talk about stage one, awareness, what we're really talking about is bringing awareness to the symptoms of when you experience that stress response. Now, as mentioned, that can be something as simple as your heart beating in your chest. It can be the increased perspiration. It can be the cloudiness of your thinking. But it can also be other things like feeling constantly tired and agitated, or any other kind of emotion which is uncharacteristic for you. So it's about bringing awareness to your personal symptoms of when you're stressed. There's also the awareness of the situations which are triggering that stress response in your body. And both of these components are very, very important. Now, stage two is the intervention stage, and this is where we are concentrating our efforts today. So we can intervene at different parts. We can intervene with the event or the state which is causing the stress. Okay, we can look at avoiding or adapting that. We can also look at how we appraise that threat, and there's primary and secondary appraisals as part of that. So for example, if we decide that there's a threat or something in the environment which is causing us unease, we then have a secondary response where we decide whether we have the capacity to deal with that stress. And depending on whether we decide whether we have the capacity, very much dictates how much stress we will generate as a result of that stimulus. So it's really, really important that we do have the capacity and the tools, which kind of leads us on to the third part of the intervention, which is the response. And what I mean by that is your physical response. So how do we deal with the symptoms? And of course, there is two ways to deal with that. There's a way to cope with the symptoms and to help regulate them. And there's to build a kind of personal resilience as well. And this is very much going to contribute to that second appraisal stage, where if you see the threat, or perhaps even your smoke detector tells you there's a threat and shifts your focus towards it, you'll know that you have the resources and the resilience to cope with that, and that will make a significant difference. And of course, the third stage is whatever intervention methods you decide to take on board and use for you, is just to cyclically review that and make sure that that's working for you the ways that you need it to, that it's effective, it's efficient, and it can be used in any kind of environment. Now, I've just added this little slide here, and it is very much a paraphrase from Damien Barr, saying the same storm, different boat. And I think this is particularly nice because if we consider the COVID-19 situation that many of us are experiencing, or in fact the whole world is experiencing, that can be considered a storm. But the way that we weather that storm very much depends on what boat we're in. If we're in a rubber dinghy or whether we're in a cruise ship, our experience of that is going to be very different. And of course, the same is true for stress. We all experience stress, but depending on the coping mechanisms and the resilience that we have managed to build, or perhaps even naturally have, our experience of that stress is going to be quite significantly different. So let's move on to these coping methods then. This is really why we're here today, to provide you with practical support. Now, coping methods help to restore a sense of inner balance and presence in the moment, okay? And they can be either a top-down or a bottom-up approach. In top-down approaches, we're really using our cognitive flexibility, our ability to think differently and to appraise situations to be able to regulate the feelings and the responses within the body. And of course, things such as cognitive behavioral therapy and such like are particularly useful at perhaps showing us where we may be lacking some flexibility in our thoughts. I find that particularly useful when we're dealing with low levels of stress. But in my experience, some people who are dealing with chronic stress, bottom-up approaches often work much more, and that's really dealing with the feelings that you have before we're dealing with the thoughts that you're having. So it's a sort of reverse process, but it can work both ways, top down and bottom up. So these coping methods should be really used to relieve and regulate the stress symptoms that are already occurring. So perhaps, I don't know, perhaps you've been summoned to the boss, or perhaps you've been summoned to your boss's boss, and you've been tasked with addressing somebody with a whole bunch of information that you haven't had the time or support to prepare for, then that would be certainly a very stressful position to be in, something that you're not prepared for. Undoubtedly, you're going to have a stress response to that situation, and you're going to start feeling that your heart's beating in your chest, perhaps. So this is a sort of time when you want to be utilizing a coping method. It's something that you need to do. You can't simply just have blue sky thinking and say, well, I could just go out for a natural walk, or I could switch my phone off, or I'm just not going to do this task. Because often within the working environment, that's simply not feasible. It's not an option. So we need to learn to deal with some of the symptoms that come up, and a coping method is a way to do that. Now, I'm going to suggest a couple of ways to deal with those a couple of different coping methods, should I say. One is to do with dealing with stress when you're in that kind of high stress environment where you still need to function, just a bit like visiting the boss's boss, so to speak. And they are basically methods that you can use which are science and evidence-based, which will take less than 60 seconds, and they'll be very covert, so nobody will necessarily see that you're self-regulating. And the second side is, as we mentioned before, to do with vagal manipulations. This is really a way to sort of biohack the body to effectively force it to relax by stimulating certain responses, by stimulating that vagus nerve. But the important, or the key takeaway here is that coping methods are what you do with stress once you're already in the thick of it. So let's move on to the stress busters. Okay, this is of course, the short-term methods to regulate stress and stay functional. The first one I'm going to share with you today is something called box breathing. Now, you may have heard of this. It's made famous by the Navy SEALs in America, who use it to maintain functional engagement when they're in significant periods of stress. And it is very, very useful. And of course, you've probably no doubt heard that if you're stressed, to take a deep breath. The truth of the matter is, most of us don't do that. Or perhaps we've tried, but we haven't done it correctly. So we haven't really had the fruits of doing that kind of exercise. So knowing how to breathe is particularly important. And one of the things that I would like to point towards, or one of the things I'd like to share with you, is that when we breathe, it happens automatically. Okay, so certainly under the control of the autonomic nervous system. Without breathing, we're not going to survive. So that's very much taken care of for us. But the wonderful thing about the breath is it can also become under our conscious control. So we can choose to hold our breath, we can slow it, we can speed it up. And that's a fascinating and useful thing, because breath is really the bridge between our autonomic nervous system. And being able to consciously control that means that we can regulate the amount of stress response in our body. So it's particularly effective when you know what to do. So let's have a look at the box breath. Okay, I'm going to give a demonstration of this, and by all means, please get involved and experience it for yourself. The box breath is really a case of taking your breath in for a count of 4 seconds, holding for 4 seconds, and then releasing that breath for 4 seconds, holding again for 4 seconds, and in, hold, out, hold. And we continue to go in that fashion. So I'm going to demonstrate this, and I'm also going to demonstrate it by making the shape of a box or a square with my finger. And I'll just do a few rounds of this. Okay, so if you're able to do so, maybe get yourself comfortable, just sat upright, and I'm going to do it with you just now. So start at the bottom of the square, and you're going to breathe in for a count of 4, in, hold for 4, 2, 3, 4, release for 4, 2, 3, 4, hold for 4, 2, 3, 4, in for 4, 2, 3, 4, hold for 4, 2, 3, 4, release for 4, 2, 3, 4, hold for 4, 2, 3, 4. And if you continue that motion, it's actually quite helpful to close your eyes and to actually make the shape with your finger and to maintain a sort of rhythmical breath. You will be able to regulate your stress really, really well. It's not that you won't be completely relaxed, but you will be functionally engaged, and that's often what you're looking to do in this situation. The next SOS stress buster I would suggest is just a simple clenching of the fists and a curling of your toes. Now, of course, if you're sat at a meeting, you might not want to clench your fists in front of people, but you can certainly curl your toes, whether you're standing or sitting. And if you do that really, really tightly, if you imagine doing it with your fists, you would see the white of your knuckles. You tense that really, really tightly for a period of between 10 to 15 seconds. So really, really tight, as tight as you possibly can. Tighten all the muscles in the arms and in the feet, and then just release. And the important thing here is that when you release that tension, is just to follow that sensation that arises. So you can feel the release of that stress, you can feel the release of that tension, and just to follow that through. A very, very easy way to release some of the significant stress you're experiencing, and to do it covertly and quickly. The other one is to take a mindful moment. And what I mean by this is that, of course, when we're experiencing stress, it's often because there's something in that environment. But we can turn our attention around and turn it inwards, and we can start to concentrate on the physical sensations of the body. So perhaps if I'm sitting here just now, I'm sitting in the chair addressing you, and I can feel the weight of my body sinking into that seat. I can feel some pressure against my back. I can feel the temperature of my body. I can feel that my hands are a little bit cold, but I'm warm elsewhere. I can feel that my breathing's nice and relaxed. And as I'm having this moment, I can feel that the speed at which I'm talking is starting to slow down. So just doing this sort of, and it's an invisible exercise. Obviously, I'm speaking to you at the moment, but it's a very much an invisible way of down-regulating that stress. And the last thing I would say when you're in the thick of a highly stressful situation is to use the what else technique. So when the stress response is triggered by a threat or a danger, we become very focused on that. And in many ways, that is the function of that stress response, is to turn your attention towards something that needs your attention. And when we're dealing with physical danger, like running away from a tiger or keeping away from a snake, for example, then that's really useful to be hyper-focused. But of course, that same stress response is often triggered by our work environment, and it's not really conducive to working in the way that's best for you. So being able to expand our awareness, to come out of that tunnel vision, is a very, very useful thing. And the easiest way to do that is to just scan your environment for what else is going on. So there may be a I don't know, perhaps something really stressful in your environment. But if you were just to sit there just now and just say, what else is going on? Well, I can see the tree swaying out that window. There's somebody over there who's going to the photocopying machine. I think I can smell coffee. Can I hear a dog barking in the background? Whatever it is, but to engage all those senses so you're expanding your awareness and moving away from tunnel vision is another very, very useful thing to do, just to pull that stress level down and stay functionally engaged. So just to remember that these coping methods are very much to help restore ease and balance whilst you're in the thick of stress. Okay, so moving on to the vagal manipulations. This is very much the bottom-up approach. This is shifting your physiology so that you can feel relaxed. And of course, when we feel relaxed in our body, we tend to relax with our thinking as well, so it's particularly useful. First thing I'd like to share with you is something called the anchoring breath. Okay, this is really good. Now, these coping methods are when you have a little bit more time, perhaps you're working from home, maybe not when you're really in the thick of it, but when there's a lot of stress going about and you want to down-regulate it. So I'm going to show you how to do this one as well. Okay, so this is really just about breathing in for 3 seconds and breathing out at a slightly slower pace for 6 seconds. Now, ideally, you want to be getting to the 7-11 breath, in for 7, out for 11, which is really, really, it's a perfect sort of rhythm for slowing your autonomic nervous system down and putting that brake on that we discussed earlier. But we can start with 3 to 6 and move towards 7 to 11. So if you just sit there, and the first thing to do is just to relax your torso, your abdomen, almost so you can just let any kind of belly release. And then breathing in for 3, 2, 3, and breathing out for 6, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and in for 3, 2, 3, and out for 6, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Now, when you breathe in this way, when your exhalation is slower than your inhalation, and you follow that with your mind, you will manipulate your vagal tonality. You will effectively force your nervous system to put its brake on and to down-regulate the stress. It's highly effective, highly effective. And I would suggest that if you can, I'd maybe do 10 to 15 cycles of that, maybe a few minutes. 5 minutes would be perfect. So that's one mechanism. Another is the neck and torso stretch. And again, I'm going to demonstrate this for you. And by all means, please join in when I do this. So it's very, very simple. Whether you're sitting or standing, the first thing I'm going to ask you to do, and perhaps you can just, really look at this so you can get a good eye of the details here. So I'm going to turn my eyes, and without moving my head, I'm going to turn my eyeballs to the right-hand side. And then after I've done that, I'm going to turn and tilt my head to the right-hand side. Now, I'm not going to bring my shoulder up to meet my head. I'm just going to maintain my eyes to the right-hand side and my head to one side. And you're just maintaining that for perhaps 20 seconds, anywhere up to half a minute. And once that time's elapsed, bring it back to center and your eye line to the center. And then we're going to do the opposite. We're going to turn our eyeballs to the left and drop our head to the left. And again, just making sure that we're not raising our shoulder to meet our ear. And just let that neck hang there for a second, keeping your eyes to the left. And you might hear that breath there. That's a signal that your autonomic nervous system is shifting gear. The brake is going on. And bring it back to the middle. And now you can just allow your head to fall to the front. Again, holding that position there for 10 to 15 seconds, maybe even longer, up to half a minute, bringing it back to the middle. And then if you have the space, perhaps you need to sit forward in your chair. It's just to twist your torso right round. And you just be holding that position again, maybe 10 to 15 seconds, and to the other side. And just holding that position for 10 to 15 seconds. If you go through those 5 different ways of stretching, moving the head, moving your neck, should I say, and your torso, and also using your eyeballs in that method, then you will absolutely stimulate the vagal nerve. You will put the brake on your autonomic nervous system. Another one, the pinch and pull technique, which is not as commonly known, is particularly useful. And this one might look a little bit strange, so you may decide to do this in different environments in the workplace. But if you're just to take your thumb and your finger to here into your ear. Now, what I want you to do is grab the cartilage, the harder bony bit in the ear, not the lobe, but actually insert the finger into the ear, not the ear canal, and just pinch it with the thumb so that you're grabbing that bit, and you can grab both sides. And all you're going to do is you're just going to gently pull on your ears and pulling towards each shoulder. So this one to your right shoulder and this to your left. Just gently pulling on that cartilage. Just really gently pulling there. And you'll find that you'll start to naturally relax as a result of that. The fourth vagal manipulation I want to share with you is something known as a dive reflex. Now, again, this may be something that you would do when you have a little bit more time. Perhaps not, you certainly wouldn't be able to do it at a meeting. You would want to use the SOS techniques. But this one is particularly useful as well, and it's to do with cold water immersion. And this is simply filling up a basin of cold water or the sink of cold water. And it does need to be cold water. You're looking at being below 15 degrees if you can. Fill up that basin with cold water. And all you're doing is you're closing your mouth. You're just allowing the saliva to build in the mouth. Perhaps if you need help doing that, you can think about eating something that's particularly tasty to you. And once that's built up in your mouth, you don't have to worry about that too much. Just let your tongue be immersed in that saliva and then dip your face into this cold water. And you're dipping it up until you're covering all your eyes all the way up. So you're 2/3 of the way up your cheek, not to your ears, but just before that point. And just hold your breath in there for up to half a minute. If you want to really be between 20 and 30 seconds, but if you do this, you're stimulating this natural response to the cold water immersion. And that's really going to shift you from this fight or flight response into a much more functionally engaged rest and digest way. Lastly is the progressive muscle relaxation. And by progressive, I mean that you're actively doing something. You're not just thinking about relaxing the muscles, you're progressively doing it. So this can start perhaps at the hands, and it's a case of clenching those fists really tight. Now, what I'm going to ask you to do is clench those fists for a count of 4 seconds. So as you breathe in, clench those fists, 2, 3, 4, and then relax those fists, 2, 3, 4. Then you can move to your arms, tension those arms, 2, 3, 4, and relaxing those arms, 2, 3, 4. And just moving all the way from perhaps your fists, your arms, your shoulder, down your torso, your legs, calves, feet, and you can follow that all the way down to the tips of your toes, tensing on when you're breathing on the way in for the count of 4 and relaxing on the way as you exhale. And they're particularly powerful ways to relax your entire body and to initiate and manipulate that vagal nerve so that you shift from a state of fight or flight into a much more relaxed, functionally engaged state. So next we're going to talk about building resilience. What we've done there is we've talked about what to do with stress in the moment. Some when, of course, you're in the thick of it and it needs to be covert, and others when you've got a little bit more time and you want to downregulate. But building resilience is really, really important. Okay, this is where I would ask you to spend most of your time. Okay, so what is resilience? Well, it's really our ability to recover from stressful events in a quick way. And that really emerges from having access to feeling safe and secure in your environment, to being resourceful, of course, to having flexibility in your thinking and your behavior, and knowing that you have inner balance. Now, of course, when we're speaking about resources, that can be your actual skills and abilities in many areas of your life, but remember that these coping mechanisms that we've just shared just now is part of that resource, and that helps you access that safety. It helps you access that flexible way of thinking and restore inner balance. So it's very, very important that you do have coping mechanisms. Now, of course, when you develop a sustainable, resilient approach, it offers many benefits to you. It increases your personal capacity to deal with the stress that naturally occurs in daily life. But most importantly, it reduces the amount of stress that you experience. And what I mean by that is when we develop a mindset which is naturally stress relieving, when we show up in the world with an attitude that is beneficial and naturally mitigates the amount of things that we find threatening, then we're really onto a winner. Because not only do we know what to do with stress, but there's less stress in our life. So this is really, really important that you build a resilient approach that works for you. So there's really three pillars of resilience in my mind. Okay, there's reducing the amount of stress, which is what we just spoke about developing this flexible mindset, the one that's helpful to you, and the healthy behaviors as well, so that you're mitigating the amount of physical or chemical stress in the body. So we can talk about, avoiding certain things and things like caffeine, not having too much of that in our system, not too much sugar, salt, or any other kind of stimulant, for example. We're looking at reducing your body's reactivity to stress. And again, that's through nurturing your body balance and good vagal tonality. So these vagal manipulations that I demonstrated, there's certain exercises and such like, which when stress does happen, which is inevitable, of course, because remember, we're not looking to stop stress, we're looking to regulate it to a healthy level. Your body's response to that stress is different. Now, if you cast your mind back, we spoke about the smoke detector, this part of the brain, the amygdala, which is constantly scanning. We can make that so that it's less likely to give us false alarms, less likely to tell us there's a threat in the environment. So, reducing your body's stress reactivity is important. And of course, the third pillar here is maintaining personal capacity for stress. So by using those coping methods we mentioned earlier, or any other that you come across or have in your toolbox so far, you empty your stress bucket. And by emptying that stress bucket regularly, there's much more space for stress to go in before it overflows and becomes a problem. And yeah, I'd just like to signpost this little phrase there, that prevention is always better than cure. And I think that probably needs no explanation. So let's look at building resilience. Let's look at it. Let's look at it from the mindset perspective, the way that we turn up in the world. I'm going to share a number of things that I think make a significant difference. And I really mean that. They really have a practical application. If you do these things, you will feel and do well. Okay, so the first thing I would suggest to you is to adopt an attitude of gratitude. What I mean by that is when you wake up first thing in the morning, rather than stretching for your phone, flicking through Facebook, social media, or anything else like that, the first thing that you do is you consider what you're grateful for, what you're thankful for. Now that can be really, really simple. That can be, for example, well, I've woke up, it's the morning, that you can be happy for that. Perhaps it's because you've got a job to go to, you've got a purpose. Or on the flip side, it could be that you don't have a job to get up for in that morning and that you don't need to do that. And that maybe is something to be happy about in that moment. It could be your first coffee of the day. It could be anything. It really could, but whatever makes you feel glad that is in your life already, that's something to bring to your conscious awareness. And of course, when we first come out of sleep, we're very much in the kind of, we're operating at a level where we've just come out of sleep, and whatever we put to our mind at that point very much is a primer for the rest of the day. And by cultivating that gratitude, by nurturing it, you're really setting yourself up for success for the rest of the day. Second thing I'd like to point out here is to be very forgiving, to be quickly forgiving as well. And that's to be not just forgiving of others, but to be forgiving of yourself. We often have expectations of everybody. And let's be honest, not everybody meets our expectations, and we never meet our expectations of ourselves on a continuous basis. People just simply aren't perfect. And sometimes when people don't meet our expectations, we often start to harbor this kind of sense of agitation, of resent. And, it really uses up a lot of mental energy. And by, just recognizing that not everybody's going to do what you want, or perhaps you're not even going to perform in the way that you want to, you really release the kind of mental energy that's involved with that, and it makes it available for the rest of the day. It really reduces the amount of stress that you feel over time. Next thing is to do something that you enjoy each and every day. Okay, so if we consider, we can have the challenging emotions, perhaps they are stressful emotions, for example, but we can also have positive ones. And it's really important that we find that balance. So there's going to be inevitably going to be things that you enjoy in your life. It may be listening to music in the morning when you're driving to work or walking to work. It could be your first coffee of the day. It could be playing with a pet, friends, connecting with family, colleagues. Maybe it's a sport, maybe it's a walk in nature. But whatever you do that you really enjoy, whatever that you would choose to do, make sure you do a little bit of that each and every day so that you're allowing those feel-good hormones, maybe those endorphins, to be released into your body, making sure that your body chemistry is in balance, or certainly pushing it towards that. Now, the next one, number 4, is really, really good. Really good. I highly recommend this, okay? And that is to adopt the average day scenario. Like we mentioned, nobody's perfect. We might try to strive for perfection, and in fact, I cannot tell you how many people I've had in my practice, my private practice, or engineers that I know who have this perfectionist streak. And it's a really good thing because it can bring about really good levels of work, high standards. But it can also be a major source of stress and a major source of avoidable stress. And actually, by adopting an average day scenario, so not trying to get everything perfect all the time or have the perfect day, but saying, this is the direction I'm heading, this is what I want to do, and moving towards that each and every day, not always reaching a new goal or a new target and such like that, but just moving towards it each and every day. You find that it reduces a lot of self-generated anxiety and stress. Okay, so try and think of terms of having excellence in your life rather than trying to attain perfection. And of course, if you need any more reasons to do this, then you can consider that by having an average day each and every day or every week or every month, you would lead an exceptional life anyway by default. The next is to embrace the humor and game frame. Now, inevitably, when we try to do certain things, sometimes that doesn't quite pan out the way we wanted it to. And to be able to look at that and to find the humor in what you attempted and what the end result was can be useful. Now, that won't be possible in every situation, but if you get used to the habit of looking for the humor in every situation, it is going to make a difference. And of course, if we adopt the game frame, then we start to change anything that we would have initially considered a failure into much more like feedback. Okay, and that's by adopting the game frame. So, for example, if I attempted to do something and it just didn't work, then I could say, well, I failed. It's failed, I failed, and there's a whole bunch of thinking and processes and a way of feeling which is going to add to my daily stress. But if I think, well, I'd done A and I didn't get the result I'm looking for, okay, so that's the feedback. So next time I attempt to do that, I'm going to do method B. And just start to look at everything as being feedback. It certainly reduces the amount of stress in our body. The next one is let optimism be your default stance. Now, many people I've met think that being pessimistic is much more realistic. And of course, that's simply an illusion. Now, when we adopt a stance of optimism as being our default stance, then remember that we're bathing in the feeling of a good result. And that, of course, again, allows us to move from that stress response or into a much more functionally engaged response. And that smoke detector, which is scanning for threat, is going to relax a little bit. It's going to stop giving us all these false alarms. And our thinking brain, our medial prefrontal cortex, the watchtower, shall we say, is going to get the blood flow rather than the smoke detector. And we're going to be able to think clearly and function much more efficiently. So letting optimism be your default stance is a far, far more sensible and practical way to be. Lastly, to conclude each day with positive reflection. Again, if you're nodding off at night, this is a habit that I've got into and it's particularly useful. And it's just to think about the things that you did complete that day. It can be something that was really, really valuable, or it might be something that's less significant. But when we start to count all our small victories, when we start to recognize that, you know what, I've got this completed, I got that completed, then that progression has a very, very strong effect on the way that we think and the way that we feel and the way we act in the future. It certainly reduces our stress level. A lot of chronic stress really comes out because, in fact, if you think of the COVID-19, we're in a stressful situation where something that can affect our biology and perhaps our earning potential and such like, and we don't ever get to the end point. It never really quite ends. And when we have a kind of stress in our life that never quite ends, this inability to control that or to get to that point can develop sort of low-level chronic and toxic levels of stress in our body. So by concluding each day on what you have completed, you're giving everything a definitive end, and that feels like progress, and that's good for you. So I'll signpost this little quotation here by William James. I don't know if you know who William James is, but he's the founding father of American psychology, which just states the greatest weapon against stress is our ability to choose one thought over another. And that is sound advice. It's not everything, but it's sound advice. And by adopting some of these mindset tips, I'm confident that you will feel better and reduce your stress levels. So moving on to the next part of building resilience is to do with reducing your body's stress reactivity. Now, the coping methods we mentioned earlier on, which we're looking at manipulating the vagal tone or the vagus nerve, is one way to do that. But here are some others that I want you to consider. So first and foremost, we must look to avoid biological stressors. You know, if you're a smoker, you know, you really want to consider bringing that to an end. You don't want to be having too much salt, too much sugar in your diet. You want to make sure that your nutrition is good and well balanced. You want to be avoiding excessive amounts of caffeine, because that makes your nervous system much more wired, much more likely to go into fight and flight response. So these things are really important. And of course, to make sure that you're getting adequate sleep is certainly important also. Meditation and mindfulness, well, there's certainly been a lot of evidence and scientific, should we say that it's been looked at and studied scientifically, and there's a lot of evidence to suggest that this is particularly good at reducing our stress levels. Now, I don't know if you're aware, but again, if you practice meditation or mindfulness on a regular basis, then we can actually see that, again, this smoke detector, this automatic function to detect threat in the environment, actually becomes much better. If we were to think about calibrating, it's much better. It starts forgetting to, or starts stopping all these false alarms, and that's a good place to be. And again, we increase our ability to think clearly, to maintain perspective. So meditation and mindfulness, absolutely, they're the way to go. Stretching and yoga, fantastic exercises for vagal tonality and for just releasing strain in the body. Absolutely recommend these. And things like rhythmical exercises such as jogging and swimming. Any kind of form of activity which is repetitive and where you get into a synchronized way of being, where your breath and the activity is coming together, is very, very good, and has been shown to really improve the state of your nervous system. Now, if you're looking at more passive measures, or perhaps you aren't able to do some of these things, then you can look at therapy. For example, you can look at basic massage therapy, and I'm sure I don't need to tell you that that feels relaxing. You've no doubt had one in the past, and if you haven't, you may want to consider getting one and enjoying it. But when we get to that point where we can relax, we strengthen our resilience pathways. By touching that relaxation place, it's easier to find the next time, and we want to maintain that in close proximity. And other things, now I'm slightly biased here because I also work as a therapist, but craniosacral therapy and Bowen therapy are particularly useful. Both of these modalities bring about really, really good balance in the body, hormonally and from the vagal nerve, the nervous system. For absolutely fantastic methods. So if you're somebody who is struggling to relax, or struggling to think or do or behave in a way that makes you relax, then consider these therapy options, and they'll certainly help you. There's a huge range of breath work that's available to help you reduce your stress levels and build resilience as well. And one that I would suggest is very helpful is the 4-7-8 breath. And that is simply breathing in for 4, holding for 7 seconds, and then breathing out for 8. And when we breathe out for 8, we're pursing our lips and making the, and following that out. By cycling that, breathing in for 4, holding for 7, and breathing out for 8, Again, we're stimulating the vagus nerve and pushing our autonomic nervous system into a state of relaxation. Doing that maybe 10 to 15 times, maybe once or twice a day. If you do that regularly, again, you're strengthening that resilience pathway, your ability to be able to find ease at any point. And of course, you can consider lifestyle approaches as well. Perhaps people have heard of the Wim Hof method, where he combines acute measures of stress, such as cold water immersion, with breathing methods, which is over breathing methods, and mindset to bring an overall response in the body, which is much more flexible, which is much more balanced across the board. And there's other things such as positive psychology, NLP, there's person-centered approaches, human givens approaches. There's a whole bunch of packaged solutions there that when you adopt, have all the essential ingredients which build resilience and lower your stress levels. Okay, so for those of you who have experienced toxic and chronic levels of stress, or perhaps today's webinar is your first step to moving away from that, I'd just like to finish with this slide here, which states you don't drown by falling in the water, you drown by staying there. And I think that's very true if you are somebody who is experiencing that stress. You know, you don't need to stay there. We've signposted the stress management strategies, and there's certainly lots of resource within Foothold, and they really are there to support you. So even if it's not this webinar today, there's a huge amount of resource available to you, which can help you work your way out of that chronic toxic level stress and back into functional engagement. Okay, so that is all for today's presentation. I think we're just around about the halfway mark, the 30-minute mark, which is great. I'm going to hand you over to Aranta, and to perhaps we can answer some of your questions that shall come in.
Thank you so much. That was so fascinating. I hope people were breathing and pointing along. I certainly was. We have a very interesting question here from James. Could you explain a little bit more about the different breathing intervals that you've mentioned? You've mentioned quite a few. You know, are there any situations where it's best to use box breathing, or the 3-6, 7-11, that sort of thing, and how they impact the body differently?
Yes, there's various things at play here. One is to do with the rhythm, because sometimes when we become heavily stressed, what we start to do is inadvertently hold our breath, or we have really shallow breathing, or it's really erratic breathing. So we want to navigate our way from that so that we experience that rhythm, or restore at least reasonable rhythm. So the box breath, for example, is really to maintain a rhythm when you're already experiencing stress. It's not to get you completely away from that, but to maintain a rhythm to stop you spiraling, stop you starting to experience panic as your breathing's helping that happen. But when we're talking about other kinds of forms of breathing, for example, when we're breathing in for a shorter period of time and exhaling for a long period of time, because this breath is connected to both the autonomic nervous system and our conscious awareness, one of the things that your body is looking, one of the things your smoke detector is scanning for, is what is your breathing doing. So when it's erratic, or when it's shallow, or perhaps you're even holding it, it's sending signals to parts of your body to say something isn't right here, something is not right in the environment. And when we flip that, when we start to control that, when we start to slow our out breath and come to smaller, so it's not about breathing deeply necessarily, it's about slowing it down, then we're basically sending the signals back to our mind and to our body that everything is okay. It literally forces the autonomic nervous system to put its brake on and go back into a functional state. Hopefully that answers the question, but if there's any more on that, then I'm happy to elaborate for sure.
Of course, yes. Just a reminder, everyone, whilst we still have a couple of minutes, if you put your questions in the questions box, we will get the answers for you after the webinar as well. I guess to kind of wrap up, I wanted to ask, we had the poll, and stress is clearly something that's affecting lots of people. And with, we have lots of techniques available to us, as you've beautifully explained today. When is that point where, techniques aren't really doing it, and you should seek professional support. How would you tell? Because
okay,
everyone's stressed, as we know.
That's a really good question, actually. I'm glad you've asked that, because sometimes it's not always obvious what we can do and what we need to do. Now, the first thing I would say is, when you say need professional help, there's something in the way that we talk about that. We don't need, before we seek professional help, we don't need it. We can do it as a sort of proactive method of building resilience even further. So just be aware that, of course, by speaking to a professional in a field who spends all the time there, they can give you tips to build resilience. But if we are dealing with a need, perhaps you've tried all these coping mechanisms and you feel that it's not working. Well, the first thing is to recognize that, and something I say in the practice, is that you're always in a state of becoming. You're always moving in a direction. And if you know that you're experiencing stress, you're applying what you know, the coping methods, but you feel your experience isn't shifting, or perhaps it's even getting worse, then you know the trajectory, you know that things are getting worse. That's probably a key indicator that you need additional support. I think the other thing is to realize that is to look at your symptomology. So stress has an effect on how we feel and act and behave. But if you're starting to notice that you're becoming much more irritable, or perhaps it's getting worse than that, perhaps you've exhausted your body's ability to cope with stress, regardless of the coping mechanisms, and you're struggling to get up in the morning, perhaps your energy levels are so low, you're not really interested in engaging with people or your work, everything seems a bit black and white, a bit grey, then these are symptoms that, you know, you've been in chronic stress for a long time, perhaps you've been too strong for too long, and that's now time to consider seeking support. And again, of course, Foothold has many different ways and methods for doing that. So yeah, don't hang back. Certainly put your hand up and ask for support when you feel that you need it.
Brilliant. That's a great thought to finish on. Thank you so very much again for the presentation. It was so interesting. And thank you everyone for bearing with us and being with us today. So I just wanted to remind everyone that if you are a member of the IET or your partner is a member, you are eligible for lots and lots of support from Foothold, and that includes therapy and counselling sessions if you recognise that that's something that you need. So please don't hesitate to get in touch with us. But for now, I'll say thank you again, and we really hope to see you in one of our next webinars. As you leave the webinar, there will be a very short survey that pops up. See, that word escaped me there. And if you could give us your thoughts for a couple of seconds, that would be really, really helpful, because we do want to support you the way that works for you. And that's all for today. Thank you very much for being here, and we will see you next time.
Thank you.